Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest, Alex Koksharov, who is a London-based geopolitical risk analyst, and Alex has previously worked for nearly 10 years for S&P Global. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you so much for having me.
Alex, today is 4 years after Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenka has claimed to have won presidential elections, which we know was a purely fake result, and he has definitely lost them. But he stays in power for 4 years by now, and it seems that nothing threatens his power grip. What has happened back then, and why was he so successful in staying in power?
All the evidence suggests that in the 9th of August 2020 presidential election, Lukashenko did not win the election, and the reports from the polling stations which were available were clearly demonstrating that the opposition candidate Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was definitely in the lead. But what happened is that Lukashenko declared himself a victor with an unrealistically high percentage of votes, and he was supported by other authoritarian leaders, primarily, especially importantly, by the Russia's President Vladimir Putin, who have continued providing support to him as a result, facilitating his continued stay in power. The Belarusians have protested in unprecedented mass protests in Belarusian history. There are estimates that up to 1 million people in Belarus, which had a population of about 9.3 million people at the time, took part at least in one of the protests between August and December 2020. These protests were violently dispersed by the police, who have used violence and mass detentions. Dozens of thousands of people were detained. Many were tortured. Some people were raped and injured while in detention. And it all facilitated Lukashenko's stay in power. And 4 years on, he's still de facto president. Majority of democracies, including all the Western countries, but also Ukraine, no longer recognize him as a legitimate ruler of Belarus, but de facto he is in control. And he managed to stay in power because he received support from Russia, from Putin, and the state apparatus, which was selected by Lukashenko for over 25 years, and all these people were picked by him one by one. They continued to be loyal to him. The same goes for the security forces and the army. They have remained loyal, and as a result, all these mass protests have been dispersed and they have dissipated. There has been massive crackdown on independent media and the civil society of Belarus. Journalists, political activists were either sent to prison or into exile abroad. And right now, Belarus is really a full-blown dictatorship, which is obviously very sad for the people who remain there. There are estimates that about 500,000 Belarusians have left the country since, and it's a huge number for Belarus, a country of just slightly more than 9 million people in 2020. So the impact of what has happened in 2020, and this impact has been largely negative, is absolutely massive for Belarus.
That is what we remember from back then. Hundreds of thousands of people protesting peacefully, Belarusian Lukashenko loyal riot police firing rubber bullets against them. Some of that shots were lethal. We know that several people have been killed by police shots. And then these mass detentions, mass torture. We remember that the survivors reported that they have been marked at the police stations with different colors yellow, green, red, which marked how severely people should be beaten, should they be like mutilated or just beaten. And that was a level of unprecedented brutality in this region for decades. But now, like we see that Lukashenko's this fact that Lukashenko has stayed in power and that he remained very loyal ally of Vladimir Putin of Russia, and the fact that he has provided his territory to the Russian troops, it led practically to the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine, and it was practically the start of a chain of events. Could these events have been prevented if the West would have acted decisively back then? And how could the West act back then?
I honestly don't think that the West would have interfered in what was happening in Belarus in 2020 because fundamentally it was a domestic internal development. I agree with you that events of 2020 have led to international isolation of Lukashenko's regime, which only increased his dependency on the Kremlin, on Moscow, on Putin. And it eroded Belarusian sovereignty, and it allowed Putin to basically dictate the terms of Russian military presence on Belarus and Russian military engagement in Belarus, where all the decisions were made in Russia, and there was basically no autonomy on the decision of Russian troops not being based in Belarus or not launching their offensive towards Kiev from Belarusian territory. I seriously doubt that the West would have interfered, most probably due to the Western considerations about the international law and legality of such a potential incursion into Belarus. I think one of the factors which most probably has prevented any more decisive action by the West was the fact that Belarus was in multiple alliances with Russia, both bilateral and multilateral, including the CSTO. And the thinking was that any action on Belarusian territory would lead to retaliation by Russia.
But one could have recognized Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as a winner of the election as president-elect, which could have led many claim to a sort of crack in the Belarusian elites, maybe at least some city mayors or some ministers or deputy ministers or police officers would have declared after that their loyalty to a new president-elect. But anyway, you're right that the understanding of the risks was quite different back then. But if we come today to the situation, what we have now, is Lukashenko a loyal ally of Putin? Can Putin rely on Lukashenko? We can see like very different situation now. Russia's troops are in Belarus or have been stationed to Belarus. Putin has moved his nuclear weapons to a certain extent to Belarus, following Lukashenko's wish. But Belarusian troops have never participated actively, for example, in Russia's war against Ukraine. What is the balance of power now?
I'll start with the first question about, could the West have legitimized Tikhanovskaya as a legitimate leader? I think largely it was probably not possible on procedural reasons because there was lack of evidence, as the Lukashenko-controlled Central Election Commission of Belarus has physically destroyed the ballots. So there was very little physical evidence to give to any Western countries. Only one country, Lithuania, by parliamentary vote, has accepted Tikhanovskaya as Belarus' legitimate president-elect. We've seen that other countries have not done so. But despite the lack of this legitimacy from the legal standpoint, we see that Tikhanovskaya's activity and the activity of her office outside of the country has been incredibly well received among Western countries, and she's incredibly active diplomatically. She visits multiple Western countries regularly holding very high-profile meetings at the levels of ministers, prime ministers, presidents. She attends important summit, most recently the European Political Community Summit, which was held in July in the UK, where she was representing Belarus while the Lukashenko regime was absent. So I still think that, to a degree, effectively, she still has this legitimacy, and she is very actively keeping Belarus on the agenda of Western international community in terms of sanctions, in terms of situation with human rights in Belarus, and in terms of Belarus being under, significant unequal relationship with Russia. Going back to the issue of Russian military presence in Belarus, majority of Russian troops have been withdrawn by the end of 2022, largely because Russia needed those forces in Ukraine to capture more territory in Donbass. There are still some small units which are on Belarusian territory, and yes, Russia has moved nuclear weapons to Belarusian territory in breach of several international laws. And this is obviously creating a very negative situation. We've also seen that Belarus has been active as an ally of Russia, where it would move some of its troops close to the Ukrainian border, thus necessitating Ukrainian troops deployments to Belarusian border as protection against potential incursions. But what we see is that the willingness of Belarusian armed forces to actually be directly engaged in the war in Ukraine is very low. And this is very important. I also think that Lukashenko himself would be not really interested in joining Russia's war against Ukraine now, nearly 2.5 years after the start of the all-out invasion, largely because he knows that Ukraine would be likely to conduct strikes on Belarusian territory if he were to do so. We've seen Ukraine conducting long-range strikes with UAVs, shorter-range strikes with domestically manufactured missiles onto Russian territory, and more recently, Ukrainian troops entering Russian territory in Kursk region in the recent days.
But what we see now is also an interesting development in this power relationship between Putin and Lukashenko, as we have seen recently that Russian propagandists started to blame Lukashenko for his lack of involvement into the Russo-Ukrainian war, saying literally that his reluctance led to Ukraine's incursion in Kursk region, practically blaming Lukashenko for the weakness of the Russian army. As it's understandable that it is a blame excuse for Russia's problems in the Kursk region, how much of distrust is now being presented between Moscow and Minsk?
Well, for starters, relationship between Russia and Belarus was never equal. So Russia was always a senior partner in this relationship, and as a larger country with much more powerful economy and more financial resources, it was always dictating the terms. And Lukashenko has been previously trying to balance it with relations with other countries, but since 2020, he has been very much limited in his options. The only other options are potentially China, some countries in the global south, but they're not going to help him much in the region where he's, on the other hand, surrounded by Russia, on the other hand, countries of European Union and NATO, plus Ukraine, which is aspiring to membership in both European Union and NATO. So he is in an extremely weak position, very junior position in this partnership, and we have seen that there are a lot of demands being made to Lukashenko, so that in exchange for continued Russian support, including financial and economic support to the Belarusian economy, which is not particularly a strong economy and now is one of the poorer countries in Europe, that he needs to demonstrate more, at least political and diplomatic support to Russia. And yes, certain sections of the Russian government and the state-controlled media have publicly demonstrated with their dissatisfaction that Belarus is not doing enough to help Russia in its war against Ukraine.
But when we look at the Lukashenko's way of staying in power, he's already for more than 20 years dictator.
30.
More than 30, indeed, years a dictator in his country. It's incredible. It is like there are people who grew up, got their children, maybe even died during his reign. He has his ways to deal with threats. He has his ways to silence the opposition. He has his ways to control the economy, to get money for funding of his police and army. What is the secret of his strategy? His economy is not a prospering, booming one. He's not a leader like who has oil or gas or other natural resources like some dictators who just fund their police out of natural resources income. How does he manage to stay in power so long?
Well, in the early years, a lot of this was due to him balancing his position between different geopolitical centers, including Russia and the West, and Ukraine and China and Turkey. Obviously, everything has changed in 2020 with his legitimacy only partially recognized by a number of countries, most notably, obviously, Russia, its immediate allies, and China. So Lukashenko has been in power for more than 30 years now. And when he came to power, he initially started reorienting towards Russia because, from his perspective, Russia was the source of financial resources. And ultimately, it worked. His regime has been largely maintained by direct and indirect subsidies from Russia over the decades. Russia has been supplying oil to Belarus at domestic prices, which was later processed and refined on Belarusian territory, and the oil products were exported at international prices, and he was receiving the margin. His regime was keeping the margin, allowing him to finance his armed forces, security forces, and the army of government officials. He has been controlling all other sectors of Belarusian economy, including the potash mining and the several more or less successful manufacturers which exports quite a bit of machinery to the Russian markets or the markets of the former Soviet Union and the global south, and also forestry and agriculture. Belarusian economy remains largely unreformed, with the state control over key segments of the economy, especially in industry and agriculture. So the support from Russia has been obviously critical. And since 2020, when his legitimacy, international legitimacy, has significantly decreased, this dependence on Russia has grown. And as a result, Lukashenko is in a much more difficult diplomatic and political position because he is much more dependent on those pressures which Russia is exercising on him and his government.
And besides that, Lukashenko has a very interesting concept of his power future. He's raising his son, Nikolai, as a heir. And we have not seen like him a lot recently, but back to 2020, there was practically no public appearance of Lukashenko without his son. What is happening now with this crown prince of Belarusian dictatorship?
Everything we know about Lukashenko indicates that he clearly intends to rule over Belarus for his lifetime. He's approaching the age of 70. Curiously, when he ran for presidency in 1994, he was 39. And his motto in the election campaign was that the time of 70-year-old politicians is over. It's time for the younger generation. And, he's been in power for more than 30 years now, and he's about to become the 70-year-old politician. who is unwilling to step down. Belarus will have to have an election next year by August 2025. The changes to Belarusian legislation mean that no genuine opposition can take part because they are disqualified on procedural grounds such as residency requirements and so on. So he clearly intends to steal another election in 2025 and stay in power for as long as he is alive, and probably to conduct a succession within his family. Again, everything suggests that his youngest son, Mykola, is his preferred successor. But, he's very young. He's only 19. He's about to turn 20. There are reports that he is a student at Beijing University studying biochemical sciences, bioengineering. So it doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to be interested in a political career. But, we've seen this in the past that, look at Syria, where the succession went within a family to Bashar al-Assad, who initially was not trained to be a politician. So clearly the intention is to have a succession within the family. But again, under Belarusian law, nobody can run for presidency until the age of 35, which means another 15 years from now for Mykola. And the question is Lukashenko Sr. going to stay in power for another 15 years? It's a scary thought.
And we know, you have mentioned it already, that the Belarusian opposition is either arrested and put into jail in Belarus or is in exile, like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. And we know almost nothing, not very few, almost nothing about the fate of Belarusian opposition leaders who have been imprisoned. We know nothing about Maria Kolesnikova. We know nothing about Babariko. We know nothing about the husband of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, Sergei Tikhanovsky. And recently we have seen what in the West was called prisoners exchange, what many experts, including myself, called a hostage release from Russia, when Vladimir Putin has released several political prisoners to the West in exchange for assassins and intelligence agents. But interestingly, that none of Belarusian oppositional leaders have been released. There have been released citizens of the West. One German citizen who has been detained and sentenced in Belarus to death. He has been released, but none of the leaders of the Belarusian opposition. What does this say to us?
Situation with political prisoners in Belarus is much more dire than it is in Russia. The official count of Belarusian political prisoners is about 1,400 right now, but in reality the number is much higher because some of the families have specifically asked human rights organizations to not designate their relatives as political prisoners in order to avoid discrimination in prisons. Russia has about 700 political prisoners, and it's a much larger country with much larger population. To me, the fact that none of Belarusian political prisoners have been released, neither these famous ones such as Maria Kolesnikova, Viktor Babarika, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's husband Sergei, but also Ales Bielieskov, who is a Nobel Prize winner for peace. He's still in prison in Belarus. To me, it indicates that from the Western perspective, they still hold Russia to higher value than other countries of the region, such as Belarus, smaller countries. So from the perspective of a lot of Western politicians, a life and fate of an opposition activist or politician from Russia holds more value and is more important than that from Belarus or, say, Turkmenistan or Azerbaijan. And to me, it's very sad because it still very much demonstrates this 19th century thinking of spheres of influence and superpowers and global powers and the unimportance of small countries. To me, it sadly demonstrates discriminatory approach by Western countries to whom life and value of a Russian political activist completely unjustly imprisoned in Russian prisons, and obviously I support their release, is still more important than that of somebody who is in prison in Belarus. And to me, this is sad. Again, I'm glad that people are no longer in Russian prisons. I don't want anybody to be in a Russian prison. But the fact that Belarusian political prisoners were completely overlooked, or the fact that Ukrainians who are in Russian prisons, both prisoners of war, but also civilians. We know of hundreds, if not thousands, of cases of Ukrainian civilians detained and kept in prisons in Russia, that none of these have been released. To me, just shows this very much colonial approach, where Russia is important, but countries such as Belarus and Ukraine are not so much important.
Talking about these relations between Belarus and Ukraine, they are not that ideal now. And I'm not talking about Lukashenko-Zelensky dynamic, but also the dynamics between the Belarusian opposition in exile and the Ukrainian civil society. The Ukrainians claimed pretty often on the level of Ukrainian NGOs and civil society that the Belarusian opposition was too passive from their point of view, and often too weak on Russia, on Belarusian criticism towards Vladimir Putin. And in Ukraine, we can hear voices which say that Belarusians needed to be more strict and more decisive. How much does this perception influence the future of relations between Ukraine and future free Belarus?
Yes, sadly, relations between the Ukrainian government, but also the Ukrainian third sector, the NGOs and civil society, and the Belarusian opposition in exile is far from ideal. We know there have been several face-to-face meetings between Zelensky and Tikhanovskaya, but mostly in the context of international summits, and there have been no direct interactions, which would be purely bilateral. I think the decisions of the governments to keep some distance, the Ukrainian government to keep some distance from Tikhanovskaya and other opposition figures from Belarus, is probably driven by practical considerations of attempting not to upset Lukashenko too much, thus not to drive him closer to Moscow, and thus not to align his military and security strategy and tactics with Moscow this much. But in terms of the civil society and NGOs, I think it's partly driven by the fact that there is lack of knowledge about Belarus and what's happening in Belarus and the level of repression. Ukraine hasn't experienced this level of repression within the Ukrainian government-controlled territory, since Ukraine became independent. So I think there is sadly a lack of understanding of the context of why Belarusian opposition maybe is not as vocal and is not as is not supporting violent methods as some Ukrainians would have preferred. But I know that there are some bridges being built between the various Belarusian organizations in exile and both the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian civil society. There are some fora for the dialogue and there are contacts taking place. So I do hope that over time these difficult challenges are going to be addressed and that Ukrainians will see that Belarusians, and we're talking about a very large Belarusian diaspora, more than 1 million Belarusians are now living outside of the country, if not 1.5 million. That these people are natural allies of Ukraine. And so reaching out to these people is going to be beneficial to Ukraine, Ukrainian security and Ukrainian society. We are historically intertwined, Belarusians and Ukrainians. And without freer Belarus in the future, it will be very difficult to have security for Ukraine, and to have truly democratic and secure Ukraine, because as long as Belarus remains in the Russian under the Russian control, effectively as a Russian vassal state, it will be a source of various security risks for Ukraine and for the wider region, Poland, Lithuania, and wider.
Indeed, and we have seen how Belarus was used by Russia recently to threaten not only Ukraine with the invasion from the north, but also against Poland and Lithuania by tunneling a lot of people who have been brought from the Middle East, people who have been lied to and been brought to Minsk because of these lies, and then they were forced practically to storm the border of the European Union. People have been instrumentalized by both Lukashenka and Putin's regimes in order to use them as the pressure tool against the European Union, and that is not the only way how Belarus is being used by Russia as leverage against the European Union and NATO and Ukraine. A lot of challenges are facing the nation of Belarus, and a lot of fight stays in front of it. Thank you so much. It was Alex Kcharev, who is a London-based geopolitical risk analyst, and Alex has previously worked for nearly 10 years for S&P Global, and Belarus is one of his interests, of his professional interest, and country with which he has worked for many years. Thank you so much, Alex, and have a good day.
Thank you, Sergey. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and stay with Ukraine.